Yes, I'm going to talk this morning about some preliminary results from my postdoc work at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, looking at an ammonite assemblage essentially from the KPG boundary at the Brazos River in Texas. And this is work I've been doing along with a large group of collaborators from several different institutions. So I don't think I need to introduce the KPG mass extinction event. Really, it's probably the most famous sort of event in the geological record, responsible for the final extinction of various groups of charismatic megafauna, the Ammonites and these things, the dinosaurs. And of course, we're interested in studying the fossil record of different groups at the KPG boundary to try to see whether the pattern of extinction matches with potential drivers for the extinction event, notably the bolide impact at Chicxulub in Mexico, versus the sort of the Deccan Traps volcanism, and how does the pattern we see in the rock record reflect what might have caused this event. So thinking about the Ammonites, of course, there's about 30 sites with Ammonites around the world that correlate to the final 500,000 years of the Cretaceous, the Maastrichtian stage of the Cretaceous. And these provide a really nice picture of the global diversity and abundance of this group prior to the KPG mass extinction. We think there's probably about more than 30 genera and potentially more than 60 species present in the latest Maastrichtian, and this is just a sort of sample of some of these sites. And these sites are sort of studied, they're well known, but they're studied to varying degrees, and I want to talk today about site number 8 in that red box there. This is the famous, or maybe infamous, Brazos River section in Texas. A series of outcrops along the Brazos River and little tributaries off the Brazos River, notably Cottonmouth Creek and Darting Minnow Creek, which contain a really expanded KPG boundary sequence. This is a very nice place to go and do field work. Texas has its own charismatic megafauna. The outcrops are all located on private land on a cattle ranch, and the owners are very happy to let people come in and look for fossils. So there has been some previous work done on the Maastrichtian sediments in this area. So in 2001, Kennedy et al. Described a small fauna of Ammonites from sort of historic collections, but really this was presented with little stratigraphic context, and actually the stratigraphy of this site is not easy to understand, and it plays a big part in trying to piece together sort of diversity patterns. These are a couple of photos taken from Andy Layton's PhD thesis. Andy was a student at Plymouth University with Malcolm Hart. These were a series of cores that were made in the Brazos River area away from those outcrops. And what you see here is essentially they've actually cored through a whole load of Ammonites. And when you're taking tiny drill cores and you're coring through Ammonites, this perhaps gives you a hint that there might be quite a lot of material here. So with that in mind, my colleague Neil Landman at the American Museum of Natural History set up a series of field trips to the Brazos section. So the first one in September 2015, and then most recently this year in April 2017, to basically go and have a look at this fauna, collect it systematically and study its relation to the KPG boundary and the mass extinction. So just to give you an overview of the stratigraphy of these sites, they're not very big outcrops, not very extensive, only a couple of meters thick. The first one is Cottonmouth Creek here, and we're focusing on this one section through the waterfall here at Cottonmouth Creek. And what you essentially have in terms of the stratigraphy is the Corsicana formation, which is actually abundantly fossiliferous, a laminated mudstone with occasional nodule layers, we think probably deposited in water depths of 70 to 75 meters. This is overlain by an event deposit at the KPG boundary, which is a basal mass flow unit containing impact spherules, the ejecta from the Chicxulub impact event, overlain by these sandstone units, which are interpreted either as tsunamites or tempestite sandstones. What's interesting about Cottonmouth Creek is we also have this bentonite ash layer about 20 to 30 centimetres below the KPG boundary. And in 2012, Malcolm Hart and colleagues actually did some preliminary dating work on that. So we actually have a date on the bentonite ash, which is really nice and provides an age constraint on this section. And we've also done some microfossil dating here as well, which I'll talk about in a moment. The other section we looked at is Darting Minnow Creek, and here you have a similar sort of stratigraphy. You have the Corsicana formation, again very similar. But the event deposit here is much bigger and much thicker than at Cottonmouth Creek, which is only less than a kilometre away, and this is one of the reasons why these sections are quite difficult to interpret. Here again you have this basal mass flow unit, which is overlain by this sort of sandstone unit with spherules, and then the tempestite interbedded sandstones and mudstones. And the KPG event deposit has been the source of a lot of controversy in these sections. I'm not going to talk about it too much today, other than to say that in the basal 2 units of the event deposit, we do actually have macrofossils, and the preservation of these macrofossils is actually surprisingly good. It's 3-dimensional, and these are mixed in with the Chicxulub impact ejecta, the spherules. So what did we find? Well, one of the most important things we found and confirmed straight away is the presence of this ammonite taxa, Discoscaphites iris, and this is really important for Maastrichtian biostratigraphy and correlating the Brazos fauna with others around the US. This is a dimorphic ammonite, so here you've got a macroconch and a microconch. We also found what we think is a new species of Discoscaphites from less than a metre below the KPG boundary. So this is something we're going to be describing, and that's obviously quite interesting because maybe there is a sort of hidden diversity. The ammonites are sort of speciating before the extinction. The other main group in the Brazos fauna is the baculites, these straight-shelled heteromorphs, Eubaculites carinatus and Laticarinatus. And these 2 genera, Eubaculites and Discoscaphites, dominate the fauna. So it's a quite high abundance but relatively low diversity fauna. We also have a sort of regular ammonite, so the previous 2 were these heteromorph forms like Sphenodiscus. These tend to be pretty poorly preserved, but they do compare very well with other Maastrichtian records from around the US. A really interesting thing we found is one specimen, this little guy here. This is the first record of a litosseratid ammonite, belongs to the genus Gordriceros, from the Maastrichtian of North America. And this again was collected from less than a metre below the KPG boundary at Darting Minnow Creek. And this is the sort of distribution of this genus in the Maastrichtian, so it suggests again sort of persistent links between this region and the Tethys and Indo-Pacific realms, and again suggests that there are quite a lot of these things around right before the extinction. You also find a lot of ammonite jaws in this deposit, so quite well preserved. You see the organic outer layer here on some of these and the sort of calcitic layer as well, and there are juvenile ammonites in these sections as well in quite some abundance, with the very nice juvenile ornament preserved. And so when you find jaws and juveniles and all growth stages, it really shows you've got a living population. Just to quickly run through the range chart here, this is Cottonmouth Creek, so we were collecting above and below the bentonite ash layer. So here you've got quite a small fauna and jaws. In terms of the actual abundance here, this is just literally, I haven't corrected for sampling. There are some sampling issues with some of these plots, but just to show you that there actually are hundreds of specimens of these things around at the time. Darting Minnow Creek, we've got a slightly larger fauna. Again, you can see the abundance of these things. And here the ammonites actually extend. You do find specimens in the event bed itself, and some of them are actually really nice 3-dimensional specimens as well. So what does this mean? Well, we're essentially looking at an assemblage that exists in the last 300,000 years of the Cretaceous, and this is because all of these taxa are found at comparable sites in the Gulf Coast, the eastern Gulf Coast and the Atlantic coastal plain. So this is an assemblage that exists all along this margin, the Discoscaphites iris range zone, the last ammonite biozone in North America. And we also have characteristic microfossil taxa which tell us we're looking at a fauna from right before the extinction in Cron C29R. We've also done some geochemistry on these things, so the shell material is quite well preserved. These are just some pictures, SEM images of sort of nacreous shell material. We used the PI index of Cochrane et al. To generate water temperatures. What's interesting about this is actually just comparing the values from different groups to think about what these animals were actually doing. So what you see is the temperatures from these 2 heteromorph genera are actually very similar to the benthos in the section. So these are probably essentially nectobenthic animals. When we look at the values from the Sphenodiscids, however, these are much more similar to the planctic foram. So we can see that the different ammonites are living in different parts of the water column, tells us something about the ecology and also about the water temperature at Brazos in the latest Cretaceous. We can make comparisons to other sites in the Gulf Coast. So this is the Owl Creek Formation in Mississippi, where a similar study was done by some colleagues in 2015, and essentially they found similar temperatures and also a similar result. The discoscaphites and the eubaculites are much more similar to the benthos, and then Sphenodiscus is up with the plankton. So starting to build up a picture of the sort of ecology of these extinct animals. One other thing we've done is we've done some sedimentary geochemistry. We've looked at mercury concentrations in these sections, and mercury is one of those really trendy proxies in mass extinction research at the moment because they're considered a robust proxy for LIP volcanism. And of course, if we're thinking about whether the KPG extinction was related to the Deccan volcanism, this is a paper from a plot from Eric Font et al. In 2014. This is a KPG boundary in France, and they found these mercury anomalies right below the KPG boundary, which they correlated to an interval of increased fragmentation in forams, a potential ocean acidification event driven by Deccan volcanism. And we've basically done some mercury stratigraphy at Brazos, and actually the key thing to look at here are these plots where you normalize your mercury data to total organic carbon, and there's actually not a lot going on below the boundary. And again, at Darting Minnow Creek, there's not a lot going on. You see these increased values in the event bed. This, I think, is a diagenetic signal. I don't have time to talk about that right now, but you can ask me about it afterwards. I don't actually think here we've got much evidence for mercury anomalies below the extinction. So just some preliminary conclusions from this work. The Corsicana Formation at Brazos contains a low diversity but very high abundance ammonite fauna. We've got the first record of this genus from the Maastrichtian of North America, which is nice. We can correlate this fauna very nicely to others from around the Gulf and Atlantic coastal plains. So we're looking at the last ammonites right before the mass extinction. We've got some oxygen isotope data, which we can use to think about the ecology of these different groups. We don't see much evidence for mercury loading from Deccan volcanism. And I would suggest really that this data is showing that ammonites are thriving in the Gulf Coast immediately prior to their very sudden catastrophic extinction at the boundary, which I would suggest is related to the Chicxulub impact. So I'd just like to acknowledge the Lerner Gray Fund, which the AMNH, which funds my postdoc fellowship, a bunch of people for help in the field, Steve for the photography, and Isotopes from Santa Cruz. Thank you very much for coming.